In this episode, we move into a part of AI governance that can feel intimidating at first, but is actually very grounded. Data governance that is strong enough to be tested and verified by someone outside the team. Beginners often hear data governance and imagine a mountain of paperwork or a set of rules that only a database expert could understand. The simpler truth is that data governance is the discipline of knowing what data you have, where it came from, who owns it, how it is allowed to be used, and how you prove you followed those rules. For AI, this matters more than many people expect because data is not just a supporting resource. It shapes model behavior, influences outcomes, and creates privacy and security exposure. When an auditor asks how a training dataset was built or how a system uses personal data, they are really asking whether the organization can demonstrate control, not just claim good intentions. Building auditable data governance means designing rules and records that can be checked and that can survive staff turnover, tool changes, and time pressure. The goal is to learn how to build data governance that is operational, evidence-based, and verifiable, not just aspirational. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong way to begin is to understand what auditors are actually trying to do when they test data governance, because it is rarely about catching people on technical trivia. Auditors test whether the organization's controls exist, whether they are being followed, and whether the organization can prove that they are being followed with consistent evidence. That means data governance must produce traceable answers to questions like what data sources were used, why they were used, who approved them, and what limitations apply. It also means the organization can show how data risks like privacy exposure, bias, and quality issues are being managed through repeatable controls. Beginners should notice that auditability is about repeatability and evidence, because a one-time explanation is not enough if it cannot be supported by records. Auditors also care about whether data governance is applied consistently across systems, because inconsistent rules are hard to defend. For AI, this consistency is essential because the same dataset might be reused across multiple models or use cases. When governance is auditable, you can demonstrate control even under scrutiny, which protects both the organization and the people affected by AI outcomes. The first building block of auditable data governance is clear data ownership, because ownership is what makes accountability real. Data ownership means a named role or team is responsible for deciding what the data is for, who can use it, and what conditions must be met. Beginners sometimes assume the team that stores the data owns it, but storage and ownership are different. The owner is the steward who understands the business purpose, the sensitivity, and the obligations attached to the data. For AI, data ownership is critical because data can be used for training, evaluation, and ongoing operation, and those uses have different risks. If ownership is unclear, data may be reused in new contexts without proper approval, which is a common pathway to privacy and compliance issues. Auditable governance requires that ownership is documented and that ownership decisions are recorded in a way that can be retrieved. When auditors ask who authorized a dataset for AI training, the organization should be able to answer with a clear owner and a clear approval record. That is what turns ownership into proof. Data classification is the next key element because governance cannot be consistent if sensitivity is not defined. Classification is the practice of labeling data based on its sensitivity and the rules that apply to it. For example, some data might be public, some might be internal, some might be confidential, and some might be highly restricted because it includes personal identifiers or regulated information. Beginners should understand that classification is not only about privacy, because even non-personal data can be sensitive if it reveals business secrets or security details. In AI systems, classification matters because data may be copied into training sets, mixed with other sources, or exposed through outputs if the system reproduces sensitive content. Auditable governance requires that classification rules are defined, that data is actually labeled according to those rules, and that classification influences access control and allowed uses. If classification exists only as a policy statement but is not applied to real data assets, an auditor will see that as a control gap. When classification is applied consistently, it becomes a foundation for enforceable and testable controls. After ownership and classification, auditors will often look for data inventory, which is the organization's ability to list what datasets exist and what they are used for. Beginners sometimes assume inventory is a technical catalog, but the core purpose is accountability and visibility. AI data governance needs inventory because teams can otherwise create shadow datasets, duplicate data, or reuse data without approval, and those behaviors create unmanaged risk. Inventory should include basic descriptors like dataset name, owner, classification, source, purpose, and approved use contexts. It should also indicate whether the dataset is used for training, evaluation, or production inputs, because those uses create different risk. Auditable governance means the inventory is current and that changes to datasets are tracked, not forgotten. If a dataset changes substantially, the inventory should reflect the change and trigger reassessment where needed. An auditor can test inventory by selecting a system and asking which datasets support it, then checking whether those datasets are listed and governed. When inventory and system usage align, governance looks real. When they do not, governance looks fragile. Lineage is another concept that auditors care about because it answers where the data came from and how it was transformed. Data lineage includes the origin sources, the steps taken to clean or modify data, and the path by which data became part of a training set or production feed. Beginners should notice that lineage is important for both privacy and quality. If you cannot trace where data came from, you cannot confidently claim it was authorized for use, and you cannot reliably diagnose why a model behaves oddly. Lineage also helps identify whether sensitive data was accidentally included or whether prohibited sources were used. Auditable governance requires that lineage is recorded in a way that can be reviewed, and that the organization can reproduce the story of how a dataset was built. This does not require capturing every tiny transformation detail, but it does require capturing the major steps and decisions that affect risk. Auditors can test lineage by picking a dataset and asking for documentation of sources and transformations. If the organization can provide a clear trail, it demonstrates control. Purpose limitation is a major data governance principle that becomes especially important with AI because data reuse is tempting. Purpose limitation means data collected for one reason should not automatically be used for another, especially if the new use changes risk and expectations. Beginners should understand that even if data is available, using it for AI training may be inappropriate if it was collected under different assumptions. Auditable governance requires that datasets have documented purposes and that those purposes are connected to approved uses. It also requires a mechanism for requesting a new purpose, reviewing it, and approving it with clear conditions. If teams can repurpose data without review, the organization loses control and increases compliance risk. Auditors can test purpose limitation by asking why a particular dataset is being used for a specific model and whether that use is documented as approved. They may also check whether data subjects were informed appropriately when required, depending on the context. When governance includes purpose checks, it reduces both privacy exposure and trust erosion. Data minimization and retention are also critical because they directly affect the size and duration of risk. Minimization means using only the data needed for the purpose, not collecting or storing extra data simply because it might be useful. Retention means keeping data only as long as needed and deleting it when no longer required. Beginners should recognize that for AI, data can be duplicated across environments and retained longer than intended because training datasets are often copied and archived. If retention rules are weak, sensitive data can persist for years, increasing the chance of exposure. Auditable governance requires clear retention rules, clear deletion processes, and evidence that deletion actually occurs. It also requires defining how retention applies to derived datasets, like training sets created from source data, because those derived sets can carry the same sensitivity. Auditors may test retention by asking how long training data is kept and by checking whether records show deletion is executed as stated. If the organization cannot show deletion evidence, retention becomes a weak claim rather than a control. Access control is another area auditors will test, because controlling who can see and modify data is one of the most direct ways to reduce harm likelihood. In AI systems, access control includes who can access raw data, who can access training datasets, who can access evaluation results, and who can access model outputs that may reveal sensitive information. Beginners should notice that access control is not only a security measure, it is a governance measure because it enforces policy boundaries. Auditable access control requires that access is granted based on role and necessity, that access is reviewed periodically, and that access changes are recorded. If data is classified as restricted, access should be limited and tightly controlled. Auditors can test this by selecting a dataset and asking who has access, then checking whether that access matches role-based rules. They may also look for evidence of periodic access review. When access controls are consistent with classification and purpose, governance demonstrates integrity across its components. Quality governance is also necessary for auditability because AI systems can create harm from poor data quality even when privacy controls are strong. Quality governance includes defining quality expectations, checking for issues like missing values or inconsistent formats, and ensuring that datasets represent the populations and situations the system will encounter. Beginners should understand that quality is not only about accuracy, it is about suitability for the intended use. A dataset that is accurate for one population might be misleading for another. Auditable governance requires that quality checks are documented, that results are recorded, and that issues are addressed before data is used in high-impact contexts. It also requires monitoring for changes in data quality over time, because quality can drift when data sources change. Auditors can test quality governance by reviewing whether datasets have documented quality checks and whether those checks are appropriate for the system's impact level. If the organization cannot show that it assessed quality, then claims about reliable performance become harder to defend. An auditable data governance program also needs clear procedures for exceptions, because exceptions will occur in real teams. If a team needs to use a dataset temporarily or needs to include a certain data element for a specific purpose, governance should have a way to evaluate and approve that request with conditions. Beginners should notice that exception control is not about blocking work. It is about making deviations visible and managed. Auditable exceptions require documentation of the request, the decision, the rationale, the conditions, and the timeline for review or expiration. Without exception tracking, deviations become invisible, and invisible deviations become unmanaged risk. Auditors often look for exceptions because exceptions reveal whether governance is practical and whether the organization maintains control under pressure. If exceptions are handled consistently and recorded, it shows governance can accommodate reality without losing accountability. If exceptions are informal, it suggests governance is being bypassed. Exception procedures therefore strengthen both compliance posture and operational trust. Finally, all of these elements must be tied together with evidence trails that can be retrieved and understood, because auditability depends on being able to show the story. Ownership should have documented assignments and approvals. Classification should be applied to real datasets with labels that drive access rules. Inventory should list datasets and connect them to systems and purposes. Lineage should trace major sources and transformations. Purpose limitation should be enforced through review and approval for new uses. Minimization and retention should be supported by documented rules and deletion evidence. Access control should show role-based grants and periodic reviews. Quality governance should show checks, results, and remediation decisions. Exceptions should show visible, approved deviations with conditions. Beginners should see that the power of auditability is in consistency across these components, because each piece supports the others. When one piece is missing, the whole story becomes harder to defend, and auditors will see that as a weakness. When the pieces align, governance becomes verifiable. The main takeaway is that building AI data governance that auditors can test and verify requires designing controls that produce clear, consistent, retrievable evidence. Auditors are not asking for perfection. They are asking for proof that the organization knows what data it uses, controls it with clear rules, and can show that those rules are followed. Ownership, classification, inventory, lineage, purpose limitation, minimization, retention, access control, quality checks, And exception handling are not just theoretical concepts. They are practical building blocks that reduce harm and increase trust. When they are implemented as habits with records, governance becomes something that survives turnover and scrutiny. For beginners, the most important mindset is to treat data governance as a living system of decisions and evidence, not as a policy document. If you can build that system, you create a foundation for AI risk management that is measurable, defensible, and resilient over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.